Hello and welcome to our roundtable discussion on misinformation and disinformation, rising instability and threats to democracy. I'm Richard Crispin, CEO of CollaborateUp and your moderator for today's discussion. We're coming to you live from our co-host for today's event, the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined here in our studio by the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green. Ambassador, you represented the Badger State of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives. You served as American Ambassador to Tanzania, and most recently you were Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development. In each of these roles, you've been on the very front lines confronting disinformation. Thank you so much for hosting us, and we'd love to hear your opening thoughts on this very important issue. Ambassador.
Thank you, Richard, and go Packers, go Badgers. I'm honored to be here and pleased to open this discussion. This is obviously an increasingly important, increasingly urgent topic, misinformation and disinformation. To be clear, misinformation and disinformation have always been with us. But those who trade in disinformation have more tools and greater reach than ever before. The good news is that those dedicated to objective knowledge, those who want to push back on the weaponization of information that is a cancer on democracy, well, we have new tools as well. And today is a case in point, because joining us for this discussion is a virtual audience, many of whom are watching from all around the world. We are delighted and we are thankful for your participation in this global event. Today we will be discussing a new report, News Literacy and Misinformation, Disinformation in the Era of COVID-19, written by CollaborateUp and sponsored by PMI. This theme is particularly important to us here at the Wilson Center. When Congress chartered us some 50 years ago, they said that our mission was strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. In pursuit of that mission, we produce independent research on significant global issues like these. We seek to ensure that Congress, the administration, and the broader policy community receive accurate information that allows them to make informed choices, informed decisions. Through events like today's, we also foster open dialogue and frequently bring our policy constituencies together with Wilson scholars and other experts in the field, and the private sector as well, who so often is what really makes all of this possible. Our Science and Technology Innovation Program is really at the forefront of these issues, closely monitoring the world of misinformation and disinformation, and I am pleased that Nina is joining us here today and she will be sharing her expert insights. Today, we're bombarded with multiple streams of information, new digital platforms, and social media offering opportunities for malign actors to distort truth for their own purposes, for their own ends. This timely report tackles 5 underlying causes of misinformation and disinformation, but also offers 5 recommendations for combating them. These include education and technology-enabled nudges to prompt users to evaluate misinformation more critically and encouraging users to share only verified information. On the global stage, misinformation and disinformation can be particularly destabilizing in young and emerging democracies. I've seen these impacts myself, from my time as ambassador in Tanzania to my work with the International Republican Institute. You have to worry because a kernel of misinformation can be amplified and accelerated and put out there, and if there's no counter, and if people aren't prepared to look at it critically, it can do a lot of damage along the way. Today at the Wilson Center, we are pleased to serve as a nonpartisan forum for discussion of these kinds of ideas. It's my hope that this conversation can help inform actionable ideas for our many audiences as we face these challenges together, Congress, the administration, the broader policy community, again, as well as the private sector. So we're grateful for those who are here and willing to share their knowledge, and we're excited by this report and looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And building off of your remarks, as you said, misinformation and disinformation is a cancer on democracies and a real threat, particularly to emerging democracies. And we are so grateful, not only for the people in this room, but as you said, Ambassador, all the people who are dialing in from around the world, because you, by listening in on this conversation, are becoming part of the response. You are becoming part of the informed group of people who will help us to counter misinformation and disinformation, and we're so glad to have you. And as the Ambassador mentioned, we are releasing a report today. CollaborateUp is pleased to release this report today on news literacy and misinformation, disinformation in the era of COVID-19, sponsored by Philip Morris International, as is our conversation today, and we're very grateful for their sponsorship and participation today. And what I want to do first is give everybody a roadmap for how our roundtable is going to proceed. First, I'm going to highlight some of the key trends that we identified in this report, and then we're going to have a discussion with our illustrious panel here in the room. And then I will share the report's recommendations and, again, get the panel's perspectives. We welcome all of you to keep part of this conversation. You can send us comments and information as you go. Many of you have already sent some already in advance, and I'll be getting to as many of those as I can. But before we dive in here, I do want to give us some of the highlights from our report. So if we could bring up the first slide here on our report on news literacy and misinformation and disinformation. At CollaborateUp, we completed a round of both primary and literature review of the existing literature on misinformation and disinformation. On the primary side of research, we completed 6 private consultative roundtables with over 100 participants, and we went to many different parts of the world. We were here in the United States and Canada. We also looked at and talked with folks in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in Middle East and North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Japan. And we're very grateful for all the contributions of our academic experts, our professionals from the private sector, from media and social the media and social media representatives, and our philanthropic organizations, as well as many government agencies who contributed to our research. So thank you to all of you. Our first trend, I want to give you the 5 trends that Ambassador Green referenced. Our first trend, if we go to the next slide, please, is that evolving technologies drive evolving definitions of mis and disinformation, leading to declining trust in experts and institutions. Let me just unpack that for you for a moment. The first thing I want to draw attention to is a distinction that the report makes between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is an untruth. Disinformation is an untruth deliberately spread. That's very important because what we're also finding is that much of what we call misinformation originates as disinformation. And the other thing that is underlying this trend is that we are doing increasingly in the public eye, live on television, changing what people previously thought as fixed things. We're doing science live on television. We're doing public policy live on television. And as those things are rapidly evolving and our technologies give us a view into how they evolve, it really destabilizes our views on experts and institutions and our trust in those experts and institutions. Next slide, please. The second trend is that the acceleration of digital technologies has increased the speed at which lies spread. Lies are nothing new. Propaganda is nothing new. It's been with us at least since the 17th century. But what has changed is that because of technology, those pieces of misinformation, disinformation can spread at such a higher rate and can be a lie can go around the world much faster than the truth can ever possibly hope to catch up with it. Our next trend, please, is that the digital world has erased standards we are used to in the physical world. And what we mean by that is that if previously the standard for whether or not something was misinformation or disinformation was shouting fire in a crowded theater, that was clearly a limit on free speech. We would never say that that was okay to shout fire in a crowded theater. But all of those things were physically verifiable. Was there a fire? Were you in the theater? Was it crowded? I could actually physically verify each of those things. Now, with digital disinformation and the fact that public policy and science are changing live before our eyes, I can't necessarily physically verify all of those things, and certainly can't do it at the speed that we would like to see, given the speed at which those lies are spreading. Our fourth trend, if we go, is that the tech-enabled scale and speed make regulating the flow of information increasingly challenging. If before we had laws and regulations that have been built up over centuries to deal with lies and misinformation and disinformation in a very physical and analog world, we haven't yet been able to catch our legal and regulatory frameworks up with the speed at which this technology is changing our perceptions and undermining trust. And our last trend, and I'm really looking forward to bringing in our panelists to talk about all of these trends, is that the continuing inability to address fundamental human psychology in tech platforms and regulatory frameworks. And what we mean by that is that our brains are still built on a physical analog model. They are not digital brains. But social media has in some senses been unleashed on society like an uncontrolled experiment. And we haven't really seen or been able to predict exactly how that's going to play out with our very physical and analog brains. And in fact, in many cases, social media and digital technologies play on some of our worst instincts and can tap into those in a way that is really damaging both to human collaboration as well as to our societies. So those are our 5 trends. At CollaborateUp, our mission is to accelerate collaboration among companies, nonprofits, and governments when they want to take on really big challenges. And we wanted to get into this report and present these findings because we really feel that disinformation is impacting our ability as a society and as a collective human species to collaborate. So now I really want to bring in our panelists here for this discussion. So around the room here, we have some great, fantastic people here. I'm joined by Dan Arnaldo. Dan, you are an advisor at the National Democratic Institute, a cybersecurity fellow at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies, and you've collaborated with the Oxford Internet Institute's research group on computational propaganda. Your work centers on the intersection of democracy and technology with a special focus on tracking disinformation and promoting information integrity worldwide. Welcome, Dan. We're also joined by Christine Davies. Christine, you founded and serve as CEO of Polygauge, an online marketplace that makes public policy insights and government affairs services accessible to all through a network of policy and government affairs experts. We're really looking forward to your perspectives. Welcome, Christine. Tony Garastazu, you currently serve as the International Republican Institute's Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean, overseeing programs across 20 countries in the hemisphere focused on citizen-centered governance, legislative strengthening, political inclusion, and election integrity. Welcome, Tony. We're really glad to have you. Dr. Todd Helmus, you are a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation and a member of the Pardee RAND Graduate School faculty. You specialize in strategic communications, disinformation, and tourism, and your latest research focuses on ways to counter Russian disinformation. Really glad to have you with us, Todd. Thank you so much. And Nina Jankowicz, you're with the Wilson Center. You study the intersection of democracy and technology in Central and Eastern Europe and have authored several articles and at least one book on the topic. And under the auspice of a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellowship, you advise the Ukrainian government on strategic communications. Welcome, Nina. And last but not least, we have Gregoire Verdeau. Gregoire, you are the Senior Vice President for External Affairs at Philip Morris International, capstoning an extensive career in consumer and public affairs, including time as European Policy Director at Électricité de France, serving as the Deputy Head of Cabinet for the President of France, several positions at the United Nations, and as the Europe and Legal Advisor to the French Minister of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Gregoire. Thank you so much for being here, all of you. To get us started, I'd like to first hear from our colleagues from IRI and NDI, because I think you are, as part of the National Endowments for Democracy, you're very much on the front lines of how misinformation, disinformation are impacting elections. I'd love to hear your thoughts overall on our trends, but Dan, if I could come to you first, one of the trends in this report hits on the speed and scale of the spread of disinformation. You do a lot of work on computational propaganda. How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely with the conclusion. I think the nature of technology has changed the way that people are able to share information, but also false information. And I think that scale is a critical component that we need to really engage with. I think the concept of computational propaganda is that you are using computational systems to really engage with people in a way that we've never been able to before, and social media and technologies to automate systems for engagement, and even using organic or using humans, trolls, to do the same kinds of things, I think have changed the way that we're able to interact. So you're seeing massive campaigns online in almost every election that we see now internationally are following these same trends. And I think the pandemic has exacerbated these trends as well, in that we are even more atomized and even more in our own virtual world. So it's also increase the speed, I think, of the way that these kind of narratives can travel, and the difficulty of connecting with people to verify information, to understand how that you can respond to these trends in different ways. And so I think it's really created huge problems for the way that we're able to interact, and it does get down, I think, at the root of it to the psychology of human systems, and the way that our societies operate or have operated in the past are no longer functional in the same way now. And it's had massive knock-on effects for democracies, but more broadly in the way that we organize our societies.
So computational propaganda has really kind of injected or given what I'll call the bad guys some pretty devastating tools, and it's really hard for the rest of us to kind of combat against those. An analogy that comes to mind is like trying to get rid of a termite nest by squashing one termite at a time, whereas this thing is happening at such scale and speed. Do you see in the elections that you're monitoring or in the countries that you're monitoring, is it different from country to country, or is this kind of hitting everybody sort of the same?
Yeah, I mean, it varies quite a bit depending on the structure of the political system, the way that the parties are organized. I think there are some important things that different stakeholders can do within those political systems to improve the information environment, and often really simple things. I think, you saw Germany has an election coming up, not really where we work, but I think it's a good example because, in the past, and I think as recently as 2019, they've had pledges and campaigns for politicians to commit to non-use of computational propaganda, disinformation, hate speech in different forms, and have created this pledge that really allows the parties to create a different normative structure for how they operate within those systems. And that's been replicated in different environments globally. Brazil is an example. Nigeria, there's been a pledge against hate speech in past elections and incitement of people. So there are different interrelated concepts here, but I mean, I think broadly the idea is to create new notions about what is acceptable within politics and then create the ability of even third-party observers or civil society representatives and groups to monitor that and to call politicians to account for abrogating that. So in systems where you have that kind of agreement in place, you do see different outcomes. In Germany, I think even external forces did not have as much influence on that election because politicians were playing by the same game generally and agreed to a set of ground rules that recognized these dangers and allowed them to do that. But in a lot of other places, that's not a way that people can agree to do business. Party competition and political competition is a serious game, and folks often do not want to agree to those kind of limitations on how they spread information, how they use these forms of automated or organic propaganda, and it's more or less a free-for-all. So in those cases, you see much more dangerous outcomes, let's say.
So we can't just look to technology fixes, we need to look at social norms and looking at social structures. Thank you, Dan. Tony, you specialize in election integrity, especially in Latin America. 9 countries in the hemisphere will have or have had elections this year. How are you seeing these trends playing out in those countries?
Yeah, we have quite a bit of elections this year. We have quite a few coming up now in November. We just had one on Sunday, the Argentine primaries, which is basically a referendum, right, on what will happen in November because it's mandatory. It's kind of a good kind of fix of what's going on. One of the things that we're seeing, a lot of the misinformation that we're seeing is really by political parties and opponents, right? Kind of going to the opposite folks and what they want to see and what they want to hear. How do they kind of make the narrative? And it's something that's very concerning. We saw this in Ecuador in the election between the second round in particular between Arauz, who is former President Correa's kind of protege, and Lasso. You saw them a lot of kind of back and forth on Facebook. You saw fake accounts on both, on Arauz and on Lasso as well. One of the things that's very important, organizations like an IRI and NDI and IFES, for example, what we do is, we work quite closely with the Electoral Tribunal and trying to focus on what are the issues, what are the ethical issues, what are the communication strategies that they should kind of put in place to kind of help educate citizens so they can have accurate, reliable, real information the day of so they can make a very informed decision. So it's, that kind of thing is very, very important, particularly also at kind of working with local solutions, local issues, citizens, really making them kind of very viable stakeholders in the mis and disinformation, because you really have to kind of focus in on what's happening on the ground. And I think with that, that'll very strengthen kind of the process.
I want to pull on two threads there. One, you mentioned parties and candidates kind of countering each other or running disinformation campaigns on each other. That's not new per se. We've seen that for a long time. But one of the things that we have is pointed out in the report is we've seen malign actors who are sort of flooding the space with just creating confusion, not necessarily in support of one candidate or another or one platform or another, but just really just trying to confuse the electorate to get them to tune out and stop caring. Are you seeing that in Latin America as well?
Yeah, we've seen that quite a bit. We saw that in Peru in the elections, particularly in the second round as well. We're definitely seeing some of those things happening already now for the Brazil elections in 2022. But some of those things are actually, some of those issues are coming in, not to say from third actors, but actually from folks inside the government that they want to kind of put out their narrative. You had mentioned, public policy made on TV. Right. We're seeing that in Brazil right now. Just last week, President Bolsonaro put out a decree saying that social media companies cannot take down content. Really haven't seen this before. On Tuesday this past week, the Brazilian president of the Senate said, no, you're creating legal insecurity. That decree does not go. You're seeing an AMLO, president of Mexico, was just there a couple of weeks ago, and public policy is being done in what they call mañaneras. He's basically controlling the airwaves every morning, literally every morning for a couple of hours, and it's public policy. And his people on the back saying, right, this is what's happening today, we need to do that. We're seeing that as well in El Salvador with Bukele. Again, he's, I guess, he's a millennial president, right? He controls the airwaves 100%. Not only are you seeing that now in government, but you also saw that behind the scenes during the different campaigns. In Mexico in 2018, you saw, you had organizations of journalists and civil society organizations with verificado, which is verifying, right? Kind of bringing citizens together, journalists together, private sector together, saying these are the issues. Even the day of the election, there was information coming out saying, oh, people are filling in their ballots with pencils. That was not true. Verificado came out and said, actually, this is the real stuff. This is what's going on. So it's a very big. And it's a very big, important trend that's going on in the region right now.
The second thing I wanted to pull out there, you kind of referenced it there at the end about, as an example, trying to debunk or verify something. One of the trends that's also been pointed out in the report is that oftentimes when you try to debunk something or try after the fact, it actually causes somebody to hold that opinion more strongly, or it can inadvertently end up spreading that misinformation or disinformation. Have you seen any kind of good ways of addressing that in Latin America?
Well, in Latin America, the biggest medium that folks use, and I'm sure this is pretty valid in a lot of other places in the world, is via WhatsApp, right? You have, and it's such ease to kind of send information through WhatsApp, through messages, and so we're seeing that. And of course, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And, the story it started off one way and it just transforms itself, right? So, one of the things is, mediums such as WhatsApp are less regulated. You had mentioned a lot of the social media is not regulated. In Ecuador, for example, it is not. That was one of the main issues, right, that was happening during the elections. And it was a consequence, I think, of the communications law back in 2009 that former President Correa, a little bit more of an authoritarian president, if you will, I saw a lot of backsliding, was actually using that against, right, his opponents and against the press. So a lot of the laws are just haven't caught up, right? There's been kind of standing a little bit back and kind of worried about what was happening in the past. So I think a lot of those need to kind of catch up, right, to be able to kind of see some of these things through.
Thank you. One other comment on that. I mean, in terms of examples of practical programs, there's a really interesting fact-checking initiative in Taiwan called COFAX that works on closed messaging systems online, which is like a WhatsApp for Taiwan. And it's essentially a community of volunteer fact-checkers who go and receive fact checks from this network of people, and that want to know if a story is true or a meme or whatever is shared. And people join this and allow for an automated, it's a bot, to enter these chat rooms, and the bot is connected to a database of checks. And if the bot has the check that they want, it automatically responds. And if not, it is sent to this network of fact checkers who go and create a response. And it's interesting because it's created a kind of honest broker within these groups. So people have an argument about a story or something like that, they ask the bot. And so I think we have to think about kind of different kinds of models like this. Maybe also think about doing shared fact checking with larger swaths of media, both left and right wing, kinds of publications for digital, for media, for print, for television. And you've seen consortiums like that. Chequeado led one recently in Argentina that I think has been very successful. There's Comprova in Brazil in the last election cycle, led by a bunch of different groups. But to create that kind of shared sense and define those honest brokers for different communities, I think is really important.
Thanks, Dan.
Chequeado is one of the biggest ones in Latin America, right? That kind of looking at the crux of what's going on and how to tackle these issues. That's
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Dan. Nina, I want to bring your voice into this. You're a former advisor to the government of Ukraine. I know you just come back from testifying before a joint parliamentary committee in the UK. We've heard from Dan and Tony about different regulatory approaches, different legal approaches, some technology approaches. What are you seeing? What's working? What are you recommending to your government clients?
Well, I think there's a couple things that have really evolved in the disinformation conversation over the last 5 years since it really entered into our consciousness here in the West. Of course, nations in Central and Eastern Europe have been dealing with this for a very long time. They were wondering what took us so long. And I think one of the things that we have not really talked about yet here today that underlies all the recommendations in the report is the profit model of the social media companies and how that fuels dis and misinformation. There have just been a couple of pretty landmark investigations coming out from the Wall Street Journal that look at how Facebook had information about how polarization was being hastened by the algorithms and the content moderation on the platform, that they weren't really up to the challenge of pushing back on hate speech and things like that. And the reason is because they make money off it, right? The most engaging content on social media is often the most enraging content or the most emotional content. And so when we're talking about regulation and pushing back on the social media platforms, I think we have to think about the profit structures here. It's not just about psychology, it's the fact that the social media companies are using human psychology in order to line their pockets. And that's had effects on the disinformation landscape as well. I've just started a new job as the Director of External Engagement at Alethea Group, which is a company that detects, analyzes, and mitigates disinformation. And one of the big trends that we've been tracking long before I joined the company, something that I saw in my own research as well, is the rise of for-profit disinformation, disinformation for hire. So that the bad guys that we were talking about before, Russia, China, Iran, they don't want to be found out. So they're hiring other people to do the dirty work for them. So are political parties, for that matter. So are corporations, in some cases, doing this sort of thing. And I think this isn't just a political standard that we need to talk about. It's not just a foreign affairs standard. It's a standard of truth. And we need that to be modeled from all parts of society, whether that's our politically elected leaders, but also leaders in the private sector, leaders in academia. This is incredibly important. So those are two new trends. I would also just add the thing that I love about this report is the emphasis on news literacy and media literacy. I would kind of broaden that out to information literacy. It's not just about how the media works and how a story gets reported that confuses people. It's how these platforms work, how algorithms work, the fact that your social media feeds aren't just organic, showing you everything that your friends and family are posting. They're going to show you the cutest cat picture or the most enraging listicle to get you to interact, to get you to continue to use that platform, to keep eyeballs on the platform, to keep you clicking and harvesting your data so that they can learn more about you and sell ads, right? And educating people about that is extremely important so that we can kind of reprogram those psychological responses that you were talking about. Understanding that, oh, I'm feeling a little bit angry about this piece of content that I saw. This is probably trying to manipulate me in some way. And that's at the heart, I think, of the successful approaches I've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, they don't just deal with content moderation, they don't just put sanctions on actors like Russia, they also look at people and the role that they play on the front lines of disinformation.
So what I'm hearing there is that a lot of people jump to technology fixes or legal fixes. What I've heard from both you and Dan and Tony is that we need to think about social norms. We also need to look at these business models, both of the tech platforms as well as other disinformation for hire groups. And when we think about information literacy, we need to become more aware of how these systems work and how they work on us.
Yeah,
and
precisely.
how they're activating us. So when you think about that and when you look out over the landscape in Eastern Europe, as you just mentioned, where this has been so active, what are some of the lessons we can learn from what's been happening in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important things that we've not seen a lot of Western governments get behind yet is that this needs recognition from governments, from the very top of governments. And frankly, to look in the mirror here, I don't think the United States has really stepped up to that challenge yet. We've seen the Biden administration start to talk a little bit more about the information disorder that we're seeing. Certainly that wasn't the case during the Trump administration. And we even saw some efforts quashed by the White House that were happening across government, but we really need to see, prime ministers, presidents, not only saying this is a budgetary and policy priority, but it's one that we all need to work together on, and the buck stops with them, the leader, right? We need to see that in Congress as well. And the nations that have been most successful with this in Central and Eastern Europe are ones where everybody from elected officials to the policymakers in the depths of some bureaucratic basement somewhere understand those policy priorities. And, they're investing in people. They understand the human element to all of these operations. And that's not just media literacy. It's trying to make their policies reflective of the misgivings and grievances that people have that fuel disinformation, because it all starts with a kernel of truth.
And so unpacking that kernel of truth, Christine, I want to come to you because one of the things that I think all of our speakers so far have highlighted is the line between fact and opinion, and how we navigate that and what we do about regulating or responding to it. And we've seen several U.S. states, including Texas and Florida, consider and even sign into law bills banning the censoring of opinion on social media. Tony referenced the same thing happening in Brazil. With many large tech platforms and governments contemplating steps to regulate the flow of disinformation, how do we navigate it?
I think, Richard, it's a challenge, to put it mildly, but I think that, to me, when I look at what's happening in the United States, you mentioned legislation that we're seeing happen at more of a state level and a local level, in addition to what's happening nationally. There was just this week of a decision that the Federal Election Commission made about a challenge that was brought to Twitter about taking some content down in the fall of 2020, and then the two legislative issues, the first in Florida that in May was then challenged by a Internet Trade Association and then was mirrored in Texas and was signed into law, but will probably be challenged in the state of Texas in the coming days, if not weeks, if not days, I should say. I think what's interesting is that on both sides of these legal challenges or of any type of regulatory or legislative efforts, both sides are claiming that the other side is restricting free speech or that the other side is causing censorship. And so in some ways it's reminding me a bit of kind of the Three Little Bears, and trying to come up with the just right approach to this and trying to figure out what is the right approach where we can address the core of your question, which is, making sure that we're looking more for insights and being able to get those out of our social media experience and our digital experience than opinions. And there really are three buzzwords for me: transparency, collaboration, and then the enforcement endgame, which I think goes back to the point Nina just made about personal responsibility. On the transparency point, and this really speaks to what institutions can do, not only with regulation or legislation, but certainly the companies themselves as well, really needing to tighten their content moderation policies, and more importantly, communicate what those are, and not just in a little box where we check terms and conditions when we sign up for an account or we sign on, but in some ways I think that how they are evaluating the content, how they are evaluating their decisions, what they will take down or allow to stand, is almost as important, maybe even more so than the what, in terms of what that content is. And then regulators, I would say, ideally would be in communication, if not collaboration, with those companies to push when needed, to ask questions, but then to be careful not to over-regulate in fear of what could happen, because as someone reminded me just the other day, the commercial-oriented internet or the consumer-oriented internet is only 30 years old. It's hard to believe, but it's still very much a institution, if you will, in development. I think the collaboration element also, I'm really happy to see what's coming out of the United Nations, lateral front with some of the commissions and the dialogues that are happening to discuss how different countries are approaching those issues. Also happy to see what's happening in more of civil society, the Poynter Institute for Media Studies, which tracks, internet regulation activity around the world, or the Stanford Internet Observatory, which makes more recommendations on that front. But I think, Richard, also the responsibility of individuals, and again, the point that Nina made, recognizing this is the harder of the two, the responsibility we have when we show up to a platform to, and I think this is a big part of the report, and the excellence of the report is to give people recommendations on how they can be more educated and be more healthy, if you will, on digital platforms, just as we can be healthier with our food and the things that we put into our bodies in other ways, how to tell which apples are rotten. And that's just on the consumption side, to say, what they can do in terms of not contributing rotten apples, to the social media or the digital experience. Because I think at the end of the day, it's kind of like the election and, election paradigm where winning the election is step one. Now you've actually got to, legislate and govern. And so in some ways, just getting to a point where we have more comfort in the regulations that may emerge, out of the collaboration that's happening and what we're learning in the digital sphere, enforcement is going to be a challenge, I would say. And with that in mind, how do we prepare for that now, but also how do we recognize that in that way, it's going to be more incumbent on the individuals in the equation than it is necessarily on the institutions to really prepare for that.
So transparency, collaboration, responsibility, and then the enforcement end game.
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you, Christine. Gregoire, I want to bring you into this conversation. We've heard about opinion, bias, fact, responsibility. PMI is on a journey to end combustible cigarettes, and I read last week The Economist said that regulators and politicians are right to worry about the long-term effects of e-cigarettes, but widespread bans risk forgoing the potential health benefits of people turning to e-cigarettes as a substitute for the conventional sort, because e-cigarettes are nowhere near as nasty as their combustible cousins. Yet people, including many policymakers, remain skeptical because of the industry's past in use of misinformation. How is PMI navigating this environment?
Well, thank you, Richard. So I joined PMI a year ago. I worked for different industries before. I could say, so I work for a tobacco company, so I don't expect you to trust me. But I could say I work for a company, and I don't expect to be trusted because that's kind of widespread these days. I think you really underline the main point, and I'm going to talk about a bit investment, which is, so you take a business like PMI that has invested literally billions of dollars turning the business around in the past years to indeed get away from combustible cigarettes. And the project of a company is completely unambiguous, is at some point, if the regulation in market allows, to stop selling cigarettes. The question for that, you need trust. And how do you establish trust? Well, first by doing, going through the regular process of science and the products that we are putting in front of consumers as novel products, better products, they go through the normal regulatory assessment, and typically they have received in this country a modified risk, a notion by the FDA that a confirmation that the exposure to toxic chemicals is much, much lower, so 90 to 95%, and that's the case also in the UK, in New Zealand, in several European countries. So these are facts. The question that we're facing is that it's very hard to get the facts heard because we're not necessarily liked by everybody. So this issue with misinformation and actually how can you get the facts right when they come from the normal regulatory assessment by governmental agencies is for us absolutely critical. And I got to say, you talk rightly so, about educating people. But a couple of things here. Governments have a responsibility to claim and explain their decisions, and they have not done the best job doing that in the scientific and health fields in the past 18 months. So we are dealing with that. I think we can all agree. The other aspect really is COVID-19 has a great effect on the people and the way they can trust governments when it comes to health. So we survey regularly nicotine users because that's the population that we deal with. And I can just tell you that the link between how hard this population, which usually are very active people, net contributors to tax and social security system, and then the link with their exposure to misinformation and the fact that they can vote for radical parties in much bigger proportions. I'm turning to you, party experts, much bigger proportions than the average population should be something that we take into account.
So what I'm hearing is that we need to build on facts, we need to reestablish trust, using hard facts and educating individuals, as Christine mentioned, but also getting institutions like governments to do a better job of explaining their decisions. And when we do that, then we can help to start to counter some of the populism and other things that are kind of running throughout our societies. Yeah. Todd, I want to bring you into this conversation. At the RAND Corporation, I know you've looked at a lot of conspiracy theories and kind of how misinformation is spreading. Gregoire's mentioning this declining trust in institutions. What are you seeing from your perch at RAND?
Well, you're right. We have been doing work on conspiracy theories, and there's a declining trust. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Pandemics where conspiracy theories and other disinformation content taps into our fears, taps into our sense of powerlessness and anxiety. I'm scared. I want answers. Conspiracy theories provide those answers. Obviously, political actors are taking advantage of these things too and weaponizing them. I mean, we saw that, for example, when I think President Trump had an opportunity in a debate to pour some cold water on QAnon, and he refused to. And then, of course, the social media environment plays a big role. I know we've talked about some things, all right? Like the speed of information, the virality of information is important. But there are several other aspects, I think, that these platforms provide. One is that they provide, they reinforce this behavior, right? So the odds of me getting more likes and more shares on my post increase if I put out the false information. That reinforces my interest in doing that. And honestly, I'm not that good on Twitter. I think if I started putting that stuff out, it would be probably good for me. There's a social learning piece, right? You build community. Facebook groups are communities, and they can be great and powerful and incredibly helpful. But communities can also be terribly bad if they reinforce, if they provide social learning for the wrong things, whether or not you're a QAnon community or an anti-vax community. Exposure of seeing other people believe these things and reinforce your own belief in those things. And then they're participatory. Conspiracy theories, I think that's the beauty of that's probably the fun of having a conspiracy theory, is it's participatory. QAnon, it's not just you passively listen to information. You are an active part in unearthing this terrible thing that's happening in our government and saving children. Who wouldn't want to be a part of that? Right. So, anyway, taps into all of these things, I think.
So in times of crisis, like we're in right now, conspiracy theories give us something to maybe assuage our fears or at least explain how the world is working. These platforms reinforce them because things that are simple or perhaps oversimplified are easier to spread. I heard a great quote yesterday that ambiguity is not a rallying cry. So the more I tell you, generally the more you know about a topic, the more the answer is it's complicated, but that's not really like.
Maybe that's what's wrong with my Twitter. Right? Very ambiguous on my Twitter.
and probably very, very complicated in some of their explanations. And conspiracy theories are participatory, so they help us to feel like we're doing something. Speaking of doing something, I want to go to our recommendations, and I'm going to quickly go through those, and then I want to do a lightning round with our panel on what we can do as individuals. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Our recommendation section, Michelle, the next slide, please. We're going to cover what we have recommended for governments, civil society, and companies. We can go to the next slide, please. We have 5 recommendations. The first one is that we need to build more autonomic responses through awareness and nudging. And what we mean by this is that, yes, education and literacy are important, but if we are relying on people to be informed and to take active responses every time, every day, people get exhausted by that. And the analogy I like to use is that in schools, we teach physical education and health. My hope for my own school-age children is not that they would become expert rope climbers or nutritionists in their own right. What I want them to do is to have a balanced view and incorporate exercise and more green vegetables on their plate in adulthood. So that's more of the autonomic side. The second recommendation is that we have more tools for good guys. As I think Dan and Todd and Tony and Christine all pointed out, and Nina pointed out as well, the bad guys are able to do things at speed and scale. They've got computational propaganda on their side. We need more tools in the hands of the good guys, those people who are actually actively trying to stop the spread of misinformation, disinformation. Our third recommendation is to update the limits of the distribution of free speech. So you are entitled to your opinion, but you are not entitled to have that opinion distributed around the world. And that has always been the case. So whether or not we, how we look at regulating that, and I think there are several ideas in the report on how to regulate perhaps the algorithms that govern free speech or the distribution of that speech. And we've also seen some recommendations and thoughts coming in from you online on how else to do that. So we'll get into those in a moment. Our fourth recommendation is that we need to invest in longitudinal studies on policy effectiveness. We're going to see different policy approaches in different regimes, and that's okay. We're going to see a series of what I would call natural experiments in the EU, in the United States, in Latin America, in China, in Russia, and then we need to kind of study how those policies work, and then if we're going to look for global standards, adopt them based on what's working in those natural experiments. Our last recommendation is to focus on the fact production and distribution ecosystem. And I put the emphasis on fact production as opposed to fact checking, because I think as we heard about in our last round of discussion, the more we try to convince somebody with facts, the more actually we can often harden their opinions. So it's better to try to get to them in the first place and give them the right information in the first place. So those are the 5 recommendations, and I want to bring in all of our panelists here and quickly get a round of conversation here on what your thoughts are, panelists. And Nina, if I can come to you first, I know you were just in the UK testifying. You also do a lot of work on the impact of gender, and there's a new study, The First Political Order, How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide, that finds that societies that oppress women systematically underperform on almost every measure, from economic growth to political stability, for both women and men. You've done a lot of work on gender disinformation. How might we apply some of these recommendations to combating gender disinformation?
Yeah, well, one of the things we talked about in London on Monday with the parliamentarians was the idea that regulation has to kind of encourage more speech among marginalized communities. And often what regulation does is tamp down on those marginalized communities' speech. So the UK is pursuing some legislation that's quite interesting and broad-based that might include protected categories of speech, protected categories of individuals that range from people with epilepsy that might be getting strobed online to, people of different races and ethnic backgrounds. Now, I don't see something like that working in the United States, but I do think we need to recognize that the abuse and disinformation campaigns that we see, and again, these aren't just from actors like Russia, China, and Iran, although they do engage in this stuff. They recognize that misogyny, for instance, is endemic in most societies, and they can use that to their advantage. But it's also normal, everyday Americans or whatever country you're in, normal people on the internet who are trying to silence others, right? And this has effects on the functioning of our democracies. When only 30% of users on Twitter are female and men are 50% more likely to be retweeted on Twitter, the conversation that's happening among policymakers, among journalists, is very different than the makeup of the actual country. So I think the social media platforms need to be encouraged to stand up for the marginalized. We need our leaders to set a good example of that activity, which we have not seen from many Western leaders recently. And frankly, we need the structures of social media and whatever other internet platforms develop in the future to be more driven by those marginalized communities than just cisgender white men. Right now, those platforms and their policies are made for cisgender white men. So hopefully bringing in those different perspectives in the future.
So I'm hearing is that we need to make sure that we have a lens that incorporates marginalized communities. We also need to recognize that social media does not reflect society. And make sure that we're setting good examples online. Thanks, Nina. Gregoire, we heard from Todd about the rise of conspiracy theories and the role of rising populism and popular anger. You referenced some of the interesting research you've done into how your consumers are looking at credibility of previously well-trusted sources like governments and health officials and companies. What does that research reveal, and how might it inform the application of these recommendations?
I think that we need to share what we see. When you're an industry that has a very large consumer base, transparency is the key word in the sense that you study and you survey that population all the time, and we should share that. We do share that with political stakeholders and institutions because we learn about behaviors, and indeed it's worrying to see that the credibility of institutions is going down, particularly with populations that feel a little punished sometimes for their taste. Now, another thing which is really important is it's important as an industry to make claims, be very strict about the claims and what supports them, and so it's been a journey for PMI, but we publish our science, we publish our methodology, we encourage peer review. Everything is transparent from that point of view, and that's the only way we really stick to the claims that you can make.
So be transparent, make sure you back up your claims with facts, share your information with governments. When you look at the consumer base, are you seeing, how do you think your consumer base is reacting to some of these trends? Are they more distrustful than they were before, or where are they?
I think that there is a strong, because we're looking at a population, as I said, that is active, that had mostly for a large segment physical jobs, so they were not online during COVID-19, that they're looking at the past 18 months as very, very hard, both economically and socially, and therefore that creates maybe a sentiment that they are being punished by government, that this is a population clearly that is getting very sensitive at the level of regulation and taxation. It's not only the feeling of freedom. I think it's really the feeling of being considered lost in society and in regulation lately.
Yeah, I think we've seen that generally in populist movements overall.
Yeah, but they're really over-indexing in these radical party votes in certain countries.
Thanks, Gregoire. Todd, kind of picking up on where Gregoire left off, the Center for Countering Digital Hate recently revealed that just 12 people, what they labeled the disinformation dozen, are responsible for 65% of vaccine-related disinformation. We also know that much of that anti-vax movement had its origins in the Soviet era of Cold War propaganda. Our report has several recommendations for addressing these bad guys, the people, institutions, and governments that deliberately create and profit from disinformation that Christine mentioned. But what more can be done?
Well, I mean, so I love the report recommendations and the nudges, the media literacy. I think all of that is great, and it's urgent that has to happen. I mean, I'll throw one additional thing in talking about the bad guys is that sometimes one needs to have compassion on the bad guys. We all have people on our social media feeds who are putting out content that we realize is in left field. Either it's Stop the Steal business, it's anti-vax content, or other material that we know is false. And, bad guys is a relative thing, right? I mean, yes, they're doing bad things. They're not necessarily bad people. And if you think they're bad people, then that means that dictates how you engage with them. You're angry at them, you get in their face, you tell them they're wrong. But I think if you have compassion on them, you engage them respectfully. You provide them information that you think can be helpful for them. And a great example out there is a New York Times did an expose on a Facebook group of moms who just basically brought in thousands of people into this Facebook group to have open, respectful dialogue conversations about vaccinations. And they're finding that a lot of people are going from being vaccine hesitant to being pro-vaccine because the engagement is respectful and it's fact-based.
Yeah, I think just to be clear, in the report, I think there's a really useful diagram in the report that distinguishes not just bad guys and good guys. Bad guys, we mean people who are deliberately spreading disinformation. Good guys, people who are deliberately trying to counter it. You also have this passive consumer, which is, I think, where most of us fit. And we have this unwitting accomplice, somebody who is spreading information, misinformation, often with really good intent, where they're trying to protect their children or their family members, and they're unwittingly doing that. So compassion, I think, is a really great recommendation. Thanks, Todd. Dan, we heard earlier about this decree that the President Bolsonaro of Brazil has put out. He's attempting, as I understand it, to modify the Internet Bill of Rights and to force platforms to allow more unmoderated content. How do you see that playing out, and what can we learn from that? And in particular, how does that apply to our recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, Brazil's a really important case, I think, to understand globally, just because of the way that the president and a lot of people in his party have really weaponized these systems in different ways. And I think that gets back to the scale kind of preposition that you had earlier in the recommendation there, and that it changes the nature of the power of these kind of campaigns if it has a party behind it or if it has a political leader behind it. And the organized nature of these things, if it's a corporation, if it's a party, if it's a larger scale thing, and if it's a government, even more so, right? So you think about those levels of scale. So when President Bolsonaro is discrediting not only his opponents, but the democratic system itself, I think that creates terrible precedents for how we're able to function as a democratic system. So I think we need to think really carefully about how we can develop whole of society responses to these kinds of efforts that take into account the way that the platforms are operating in those contexts. This is a decree that was to attempt to allow for any kind of content essentially to be propagated on the network and to enable these kind of networks to actively pass information without fear of censorship. But you saw that there were responses from other branches of the government that stood up, and the Supreme Court struck down the provision, and the other parties in Congress stood up and also rejected it. So you can see that this is something that I think, as we've been discussing, is important for governments and different stakeholders in society, individuals to voice their opinions, to let governments and politicians know that these are not acceptable means, and attacking democratic systems themselves are really get to the heart of a lot of the problems that we've seen in a lot of societies globally. So the more that we can come together to really present a united front in terms of respecting those core values and discrediting information that goes against those values and that discredits systems without real basis for any real argument about it. I think the more that we can do that, the better off we'll be, and the stronger the systems will be democratically.
Tony, so Dan just called for whole of society approaches. What kinds of things are you seeing that could work, and how else could we apply our recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, I particularly kind of, we're talking about the bad guys, right? I think, I'm thinking about the Cubas and the Venezuelas of the world, for example. Despite the censorship, right, that you're seeing in these countries, I think social media and the internet is really, let's kind of flip that on and use those as tools, right, to combat disinformation and misinformation. The bad guys, authoritarian regimes, are using technology. We need to use the same technology to flip it on its head. What do I mean by that? For example, in these closed spaces, the digital space is really the only place where independent journalists can really function. So it's a space, paradoxically, where investigative journalism can actually do a lot of good. You have in Venezuela, for example, you're seeing independent media such as El Pitazo, for example, or Armando Información Armando. And basically what they do is they use fact-checking, they use humor, they use apolitical, ideas to turn propaganda on its head. So investigative journalism has actually really flourished, if you will, in some of these authoritarian spaces, and it's very, very, very important, right? To kind of, authoritarian regimes, backsliding regimes, as Daniel was talking about in Brazil, very important. But how do you use that information that their own tools, and you flip it And it's a space, the digital space, that actually has allowed,
Digital judo.
Absolutely, kind of to counter that misinformation. And it's actually flourished, right? Investigative journalism is at the heart because it's the only space they have.
Right.
So it's actually been strengthened. And
So-
it's up to us to really continue to really kind of advocate and really strengthen some of these groups.
So we got about 1 minute left. I want to hear from every panelist in this closing round. One thing, if I'm listening in right now, what's one thing I can go and do to help counter misinformation, disinformation? Christine, I'll give you the first word.
Oh, my gosh. I'm just a big believer, I have to say, as a consumer, in a balanced news diet, a balanced information diet. I think coming out of the report, thinking about if you're going to be investigating an issue, look for 3 sources, at least that have 50,000, circulation, if it's a printed publication or something that is in print as well as digital, and really seek to diversify, the inputs that you're putting in, and to encourage your parents, to encourage your friends, to encourage your colleagues to do the same, and to not be afraid to challenge ideas that are put forward, as being factual, with the quick questions of, where did you get that idea, and who is challenging that idea? Because those 2 quick questions alone can really do a lot to verify whether something is coming out of the fact or out of the opinion.
So balanced information diet, use 3 sources, challenge ideas. Gregoire.
Invest, publish, and debate.
Invest, publish, and debate. Love it. Very quick. I like it. Nina.
Check your emotional response before you share. If something makes you angry, happy, sad, probably a good idea to walk away before you click that share button.
Check your emotional response before you share. Dan.
I think look to educate yourself about basic digital literacy concepts. Look up, first draft news or, the findings of reports like these that I think give you some really good ideas about what you can do from day to day to do the kind of fact checking that Christine was talking about.
So read our report, educate yourself, do some fact checking. I like it. Thank you, Dan. Todd?
Read your report, but also think about the motivations of why people are sharing content.
Consider motivations. Tony, last word.
I think empower citizens with the right tools, resources, and knowledge, and think about the pandemic as an opportunity to build kind of greater global capacity to respond and build resiliency, right, to these digital threats.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Gregoire. Thank you, Nina, Dan, Todd. Thank you to all of you for joining us here at the Wilson Center. We're so grateful that you could all join CollaborateUp and the Wilson Center in debuting this report. You've heard some great recommendations about having a balanced diet, investing in publicizing, sharing your facts, checking your emotional responses, educating yourself, and making sure that you read and bring in yourself and have empathy towards those people in your own ecosystem. So thank you all for joining us. Please do access the report, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. I've been Richard Crispin. That ends our panel for today.